From ashes, a rose blooms with secrets. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Tell me your location in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. Let's step inside the case. It was on a gusty March morning of '90 that I was roused from a pleasant torpor by the familiar acid sweetness of tobacco smoke and the thin, insistent scraping of Holmes's bow. He had his violin beneath his chin and his gaze fixed not upon the strings but upon the corner of the mantel where the Persian slipper, repository of his strongest shag, hung like a faded trophy. The fire was low, the breakfast things cold, and the light that came through the Baker Street window was a grey so thick it might have been poured. "You have altered your chemist," said he, without lowering the bow. He decants his carbolic into wider-mouthed bottles than Musgrave's, and you have managed to baptize your glove with it. Also, unless you propose to perform minor surgery, I cannot account for your bandage case in the left pocket, which has a recent tear in the leather. You will never allow a man the small dignity of a mystery, I returned, laughing. A patient at the surgery complained of a burn from a flat iron. The carbolic was my own clumsiness, and the case caught on a nail. Exactly so, said he, and set the instrument aside. There is, however, a larger dignity at stake this morning. Scotland Yard's. I expect we shall see Lestrade. He glanced at the clock. 9:15. On the first stroke of the quarter, our bell clanged, and the rapid foot on the stair announced the inspector before Mrs. Hudson could. Lestrade came in with his hat in his hand, his small, wiry frame powdered with the soot of London's breath, and an expression which I had learnt to translate as humiliation stiffened into obstinacy. "You are early, Lestrade," said Holmes. "Either your case is extremely simple or extremely vexing." "Vexing enough, Mr. Holmes, to tempt even you," returned the inspector. "There's been a death in Cheyne Walk. Sir Felix Hargrave, perhaps you know the name?" "Coal concerns out Bermondsey way. The servants found him at 6:30 in his study, the room charred near to ruin, and the door fast on the inside. Window latches secured. The man's watch stopped at 20 minutes past 5. We've a doctor who'll say asphyxiation, smoke most likely, though he was not burned about the face. I'd take it for accident or some sort of foolishness with the grate. But well, there's a thing there that has set all the tongues wagging." "A thing?" "A rose," said Lestrade shortly. "Fresh as a Sunday boutonnière, and standing up in the ashes like a flag on a corpse. I'll be judged if I can say how it came there, or how it kept its petals when the chair beside it is cinders." Holmes's long fingers steepled. "A rose," he murmured. "And in ash." "In the grate itself, Mr. Holmes. The back household swears the study fire had been low overnight. There was a smell. Odd, not coal, though I'll not swear to it myself. The servants had water on it within minutes, and yet the desk and one wall are scorched. The door-key was in the dead man's pocket, and the under-butler had to force the panel with the gardener's bar. We've kept the room as we found it, save for the body, if you care to—" "We shall care very much," said Holmes, springing up with that sudden, elastic vigour which was as natural to him as his indolence. "Watson, your coat, Lestrade. You will give us 10 minutes with the scene before the Yard's indignity resumes." Cheyne Walk lay beneath a pall that morning. The river crawled by like a sullen creature nursing a grudge, and the narrow gardens before the houses were powdered with coal dust that had settled upon every bud. Sir Felix Hargrave's house, an austere, handsome brick with iron railings and a door as black as a barrister's gown, stood with its curtains drawn and a knot of curious faces at the rail. We were admitted by a footman who had the pinched composure of one who is determined not to faint. He guided us through a hall lined with ancestral faces to a door upon the right, where the air grew immediately thick with the cloying, damped smell that follows an indoor fire. Lestrade halted us with a gesture. "You'll see we haven't meddled over much," he said. "Dr. Ainsworth took the body to the dining room. I want your eyes on the rest before the super has mine on his report." Holmes passed within, and I after him. The study had the sad, ruined dignity of a drawing-room after a ball, but attended by a more sinister host. The skirting along the east wall was blackened, and the fine Turkey carpet there had curled in shriveled tongues. A leather armchair was reduced to its bones, the stuffing lay like grey snow about the hearth. The desk had suffered too, its near edge charred, one drawer face blistered and split. The window panes were furred with moisture and soot. Above the mantel hung a poor watercolour of a country churchyard, oddly spared, save for a smudge in one lower corner, as though a dirty hand had steadied itself there. But it was the grate that fixed the eye. The iron basket was piled with a mound of sodden black ash, caved in upon itself. And in the centre, thrust up as if the cold had recollected a memory of June, stood a single white rose. Its stem was half buried, its head upright, the outermost petals rimmed with soot, but the heart unblemished, faintly luminous in that dim room. A drop of water clung to one petal, wavered, and fell with the most delicate sound I have ever heard, in a place of death. Holmes's first movement was not towards the rose, but to the door we had entered. He crouched, taking between finger and thumb a shred from the lower jamb, then ran a nail along the brass of the keyhole. "Key in the pocket, you say?" he asked, without looking back. "That's right. And who last saw Sir Felix alive?" His valet, Evans, took up a tray at 10:15. Sir Felix dismissed him. No callers after 9 save a lad from Renshaw's, the florist's, delivered a box and went. That was 8:30. The box is there. He pointed to the desk where a long, narrow carton lay stained and scorched at one end. No card. The servants thought it odd in March, but the old man was fond of his fancies, I'm told. Renshaw's, Holmes repeated softly as though trying the name upon his palate. He drifted to the window and lifted the catch. It rose with reluctant stickiness and left upon his fingers a smear of grey. He sniffed it and made a face. "Water," he said, "and something that was once volatile." "Our man says no paraffin," Lestrade put in quickly. "Naphtha, then, or benzoline. The volatile leaves little to the uneducated nose. You have the doctor's notes?" "On the table there." Holmes ignored them. He had gone to his knees before the grate and extended the long stem of his pipe like a baton. He did not touch the rose, rather he circled it with the stem, indicating the concentric pattern in the ash. Ripples, as after a stone cast into a pond. He then leaned forward until the tip of his nose might have brushed the soot, and drew in a careful breath. I heard him make a small sound between satisfaction and warning. "Careful, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "It's treacherous underfoot, wet and soft." "My friend is never more at his ease than when the ground will not hold him," I said. Yet I, too, felt that odd uncertainty, as though the study's very air was still unsettled. He rose and moved to the desk. The drawer whose face had blistered resisted before yielding. Within were papers singed at their corners, a leather pocketbook, and a neat gap where papers clearly had been. One could read their absence in the soot shadow they had left. Holmes touched nothing yet. He only observed, and I saw his eyes go to the bell-pull, which hung limply by the mantel, its cord darkened and, yes, frayed. "There was shouting?" he asked. "None heard," said Lestrade. "The night footman dozed in his pantry. The housemaid says she woke to smell. Well, to smell what we all smell now. She roused the butler, who roused Evans, who, well, there we are. Sir Felix was wealthy, I ventured. Enemies inevitable in trade. His niece and only heir lives here, Lestrade returned. Miss Hargrave. There's a nephew too, Mr. Lionel Westcott, but he's more ornament than oak, by accounts. The man had disputes with a certain Mr. Phelps, no relation to your diplomatic friend Dr. Watson, a partner who left the firm last year with bad blood behind him. 3 serviceable avenues and a florist's boy, said Holmes almost to himself. He took up the long carton with the lightest touch and tilted it. A drift of damp, grey dust ran from the scorched end and left upon the green paper the print of a thumb. Holmes bent until the print was level with his eye. Left hand, he murmured. Small. A woman's or a youth's Lestrade made a note. We shall have Renshaw's, never fear. You will have much, and you will keep all of it, snapped Holmes with sudden energy. No zeal now, Lestrade. Hold your men from the grate, the desk and the bell-pull. Let no one with perfume upon her person enter this room. Send to Renshaw's for the list of their late deliveries and the names of those who signed for them in this house these 2 months. See that the boy is found. Watson, your handkerchief, I produced it. Holmes, with that peculiar delicacy he brings to work where physical force would serve most men, wrapped the bell-pull's frayed end and lifted it to the light. The cord had been cut, not cleanly but rubbed through as if with a rough edge, and the fibres were darkened beyond what the fire could quite account for. He dropped it, and his eye went again to the poor watercolour above the mantel. This time he stepped upon the fender and examined the smear in its corner. He set his forefinger into the smudge and then, with mischievous gravity, traced a tiny oval upon the air. "Is that your art criticism, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade asked. "It is my horticulture," Holmes returned. "And now I will look upon Sir Felix himself." We followed him to the dining-room where the body lay under a sheet. Sir Felix Hargrave had been a large man once. The puffing of the skin about the lips and the dingy cast upon his whiskers told their own tale. There were no burns upon the face and only a slight redness at the left temple, such as a man might take from stumbling in haste against furniture. Holmes made no more of him than a glazier would of a pane, save to lean until his aquiline nose hovered at the dead man's lapel. He straightened, and his eyes were bright. "Rose-water," said he. Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Well, that's not so strange, given the flower." "It is not strange at all if one does not wish to think," said Holmes. He looked at me, and I saw the line between his brows which comes when the elements of a problem have moved into relation in his mind, if not yet into array. We have here the appearance of an accident and the sentiment of a gesture. Between the two there is a seam. We shall follow it. Lestrade, I shall want 5 minutes with Miss Hargrave. Then your florist. After that, perhaps, the river. "The river?" repeated Lestrade. "Yes," said Holmes, turning back towards the ruined study. "Where there is ash, there is often water, and where there is a rose that has no business blooming, there is generally a hand that thought it had none either." He passed beneath the blackened lintel as a man goes under an arch to his own chapel. I followed, with the image of the delicate white head rising from the cinder fixed in my mind. Even then, had I but known it, the first of the case's incongruities had shown itself. The fire was not our beginning. It was only the first obvious thing. Miss Hargrave received us in a small morning-room which looked upon the river through a veil of gauze. She had the clear pallor that comes of long habit in shaded rooms, and the self-command of a woman who has learnt to hold her chin steady while others look to her for the sign to weep. Her gown was of a sober blue, and there was about her neither brooch nor ribbon that drew the eye. only a thin chain at the throat with a locket that might have contained hair. Her hands, folded upon the arm of the chair, were small, and there was a faint discoloration of the right forefinger, such as I have seen upon ladies who amuse themselves with the potting shed. "My uncle was a difficult man, Mr. Holmes," she said, when the first miserable courtesies were past, "but he was not careless in his habits. If the thing is an accident, I am prepared to accept it as God's will. If it is not, She faltered, and looked past us to the window, where the grey water moved, one thinks, with intention. Holmes, who had stood while she spoke, now sat, but on the edge of the chair, as one who asks no indulgence from furniture. "Your acceptance does you credit, Miss Hargrave. I assure you I seek only the truth, not to satisfy any man's vanity. You live here constantly?" "Since my aunt's death 3 years. My cousin Mr. Westcott has rooms in Albemarle Street. He is here when my uncle desired a man about the place, which was seldom." "You saw Sir Felix last night?" "At dinner. He complained of a headache and retired to the study afterwards. He disliked callers late. I went up at a little after 9 to the music-room. I did not see him again. Did you send flowers to his study?" She looked up, surprised rather than offended. "No, my uncle was peculiar about flowers. He would bear them in the house only in March, and then only in the morning-room because it looks east, and the sun catches them. He said that in the evening the scent became oppressive. Yet he received a box from Renshaw's yesterday." "So the footman told me. I supposed it a mistake, and that he would send them to the morning-room to please me. He had that kindness sometimes. You did not open the box?" "No, I sent for Evans to carry it away when my uncle had done with it." Holmes crossed one knee over the other and regarded the tip of his boot, which was far from new. "Who in this house uses rose water?" She started at that. "Rose water? Cook keeps a bottle, I think, for her creams and jellies. I forbid the maids any scent. It clings in curtains." "Does it?" "Yes, it does. And your own, permit me, your own taste runs to none at all?" "To none." I saw Holmes's nostrils quiver once, as a hound's will when the wind shifts from a familiar stable-yard. "You have a conservatory?" "A small one." "At the back, over the mews. Mr. Dalrymple, that is our gardener, starts the roses there for the borders. They do poorly from the river's damp unless they have a good begin." "You have glass covers?" "Cloches?" "Yes, a few." Holmes's eye lit for a moment, and then was grave. "Your uncle carried his key?" "Always at night. He had a notion that London thieves take a peculiar interest in safe locks, though ours is a poor box only. He kept papers in his desk. Evans' orders were to set the bolt and leave the key upon the table after the tray was removed. If the key was in his pocket, he must have placed it there himself. Mr. Westcott, had he words with Sir Felix of late?" She coloured then. "My cousin is too easily persuaded by the company he keeps. He's not a bad man. My uncle was severe with him. There was a quarrel last week about a debt of honour. My cousin went out and did not return that night. He came this morning." "Ah!" Holmes rose. "I shall ask you to endure us a little longer, Miss Hargrave. I require 5 minutes with Evans. Afterwards I shall trouble your cook to show me her rose water and your gardener to show me his glass. The inspector will take your statement as to hours and callers. You had none after 9? "None. Only the boy earlier, with the box." Holmes bowed as if to a princess and withdrew. He waited until the door had shut, then wheeled on Lestrade. "The boy first, by telegraph if need be. Bring him to the house and keep him outside this room. Watson, the valet Evans, had that mixture of competence and caution which is bred below stairs. He was a square man of 50, with a greying whisker and an eye that had learnt not to see what masters prefer unseen. You took the tray at 9:45? "Yes, sir." toast and a little soup, which he never touched. He waved me away with his hand. "Evans," says he, "I shall not be disturbed. See that I'm not rung for unless the house is burning." He smiled at that. "You left the key upon the table?" "As I always do." He had a habit, sir, of locking the door himself if he was reading something close, and he would open for me or not as suited him. "You noticed nothing unusual?" Evans hesitated. "There was a smell, sir?" "Not the coal. I've been in Bermondsey long enough to know coal. This was sharper, like when the mistress's dress gets a drop of benzoline to take out a grease. I thought no harm. There's a boot boy here who is liberal with the bottle when he polishes." Holmes nodded as if at a remembered fact. "The bell pull? Has it been faulty?" "It parted yesterday afternoon, sir. I told Mr. Dalrymple to see to it. He said he had no new cord till Saturday. He is not one for haste." Holmes's eye went to Lestrade, and there was just the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth, which with him did duty for an oath. "Show me the boot room," he said. We were led down to a stone passage that smelt of soap, damp leather, and the old hard life of servants. On a shelf stood a half-empty bottle labelled in a clerk's round hand, "Benzoline for stains, keep from flame." Holmes took it up, turned it once, and set it back where it had stood so exactly that a cautious housemaid could not have done better. He lifted the boot boy's brush and held it to his nose. He looked at the rag used for polishing, where there were dark smears, and a lighter one where some volatile had dried. He said nothing. He seldom speaks to announce that the obvious has been observed. From the boot room we went to the kitchen, where the cook, an anxious woman of 40 with a cook's loyalty to her blame, produced a small phial of rose water from a cupboard among her essences. Holmes uncorked it, sniffed, and corked it again. "Use it last night?" "No, sir." The dinner was beef with a little horseradish. No rose water in that. Perhaps in a custard on Sunday, and before that? "Monday, sir, for a blancmange." Holmes slipped the phial into his pocket, and I saw Lestrade's shoulders rise an inch. "You shall have it again," said Holmes, "and full measure with interest." Mr. Dalrymple now, the gardener, received us among clay pots and a faint green steam. He was a lean Scot with hands like roots. He showed Holmes 3 bell glasses, one with a crack at the rim, and a row of forced roses so pale that they seemed to hold the idea of colour rather than the thing itself. "Gloire de Dijon?" Holmes asked, touching a leaf with a finger that weighed nothing. "Aye, and Niphetos yonder. She doesn't fancy the damp that yin. I keep her under the bell till May Niphetos," said Holmes, as if the word were music. He bent until his cheek brushed the cool interior of the glass. When he straightened, his eye ran the shelf, the floor, and the little oak bench where Dalrymple kept a knife and twine. He lifted the knife, saw that it was sharp, and put it down again. At the foot of the stone stair, as we returned, Lestrade met us with a small lad who held his cap in both hands and looked guilty by nature and trade. "This is Renshaw's boy, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector. "Name of Tim Cribb. He took the box yestereven." Holmes regarded the boy as a naturalist regards a beetle, not unkindly, but as a specimen. "You delivered to Sir Felix Hargrave at 8:30. "Yes, sir." Footman took me to the study. Gentleman said, "Set it there," and waved me off. "You saw the roses?" "Couldn't help but." The lid weren't tied fast, poked up a bit at the end where the stalks lay. "Finest Jacqueminots I've seen this winter. Long as your arm some on 'em?" Holmes, who had his face in shadow, did not change it. "Jacqueminots, you know your roses, Timothy. Mr. Renshaw says a boy as breaks a crown and canna name it gets his ear broke next." "Beg pardon, sir. Does Mr. Renshaw keep a book of orders?" "He do." "To the study, said Holmes to Lestrade, with an abruptness that sent us all up like hounds after a horn. The ruined room had grown colder, and the wet ash in the grate had settled another hair's breadth, as if the house were breathing on it. Holmes went at once to the long carton upon the desk. He lifted the lid with 2 fingers. Within were 12 hollows where stems had lain upon damp green tissue. The scorched end had browned the paper, but there remained in the corner, caught beneath a fold, a petal no larger than a thumbnail. Holmes lifted it out upon the blade of his penknife and laid it upon a white card from his case. It was not white. It was a deep, tired crimson that had bled a little where water had found it. He snapped the case shut and put the card away. "Your boy is to be thanked, Lestrade," said he. "Now, Mr. Renshaw." Renshaw's shop stood in Sloane Square, bright as a parterre in miniature, and smelling, blessedly, of wet bark and peat. The proprietor was a florid little man who bobbed at us as if on springs. He produced his order book with the pride of a clerk in a country bank. "To Sir Felix Hargrave, Cheney Walk," Holmes read over the shoulder, not touching the page. 1 dozen Jacqueminot long stem, paid upon order, no card, placed at 4 of the clock, by a gentleman." "A gentleman, yes, sir." "Well-dressed, fair moustache, a signet ring, I note his hands. He had a way of tapping with his left fingers when he thought, like as this Renshaw tapped, and I noted that his imitation left the little finger a shade apart. He asked if the Jacqueminots would open by Saturday. I told him they would, if the room was warm. He smiled, and said the room would be warm. Holmes's eye did not leave the page. "Name given?" "None, sir." "I am to be circumspect sometimes. You tied the box?" "My lad did." "With the lid fast?" "As usual." Holmes closed the book with 2 fingers, and bobbed in his turn so slightly that it could have been a courtesy or a tremor. "You have nefetos today?" "A few, sir." "Poor heads this week. We will take one." He paid, and we left, Holmes carrying a single white rose in a sleeve of green paper, as a clerk might carry a rolled diploma. In the cab he said nothing for a street, and then 2. He held the rose in his palm and watched it like a candle flame. At last he spoke, to the flower rather than to me. "Red scent, white found," he said. "Smell the stalk, Watson." I did so. It was the faint, clean scent that is more air than perfume. "Now smell this," he said, and drew from his pocket the cook's phial. The liquid within was thicker, sweet, and clung to the nostril. "Rose water is not a rose," said he. "Remember it." "You think the flower in the grate did not come out of Renshaw's box?" "I think nothing," he returned, with that little cruelty he uses when, he is fond. "I observe that a lad with the fear of Renshaw in him knows his Jacqueminot, that a petal of such lies in the box which the fire spared enough to tell us what lay there, and that what stood in the ash was of another kind. I observe that a door was fast within, and a key was in a pocket, that a bell cord was cut and browned before the damp touched it, that a watercolour bears a smear at a height convenient to a hand, standing on the fender, and that you, my dear fellow, carry in your pocket a bandage case with a recent tear. All these things are facts. What they are when they are in order we shall learn." "From the river?" I ventured. "From the river," he said, "where men wash what they wish London not to keep for long. But before the water there is one more dryness we must endure. Mr. Lionel Westcott." We found the cousin in the library, a slim young gentleman with restless eyelids, and a tie-pin that was more assured than the man who wore it. He began with indignation, and ended, under Lestrade's flat eye, with civility. "You quarrelled with your uncle." Families do, Mr. Holmes. If you are without domestic discord, I congratulate you. You ordered flowers yesterday? Flowers? Certainly not. You do not tap with your left hand when you think. He stared. I smoke when I think. Then you have had no occasion to think this morning, said Holmes. And I suppose it was well that the door behind us opened at that instant to admit a maid with a note, for Mr. Westcott had gone as white as paper. The note was for Miss Hargrave. It had been brought by a messenger from Bermondsey, she said when she came hurriedly with it, and her hand shook now. Holmes took it at her glance. She nodded. He broke the wafer and laid the slip upon the table so that we might all see. There were 6 words written in a large, unpractised hand. You set the rose in vain. Holmes did not look at Lestrade. He looked at the little white head of the Niphetos in his palm. Then he slipped the phial of rosewater deeper into his pocket, as if against a thief. Now, said he, and his voice had the steel that makes even the inspector move, we will go to the river. The river lay like a dull sheet of pewter under the March sky, with only a sluggish ripple where a barge nosed its way past the embankment. Holmes, wrapped in his long coat, leaned over the parapet at Chelsea Reach and stared into the grey current as though he expected the water to yield up its secrets at command. Lestrade, shifting impatiently from foot to foot, muttered something about wild goose chases, but Holmes raised a hand for silence. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing with his stick to a stretch of the embankment where the stone was stained a deeper black than the rest. "That is soot, but not from any factory chimney. It is damp, recent, and streaked downward. Something was thrown in here within the last 6 hours." Lestrade bent, sniffed, and swore softly. "Petroleum of some sort. My men missed it." Holmes smiled without mirth. "Your men do not make a habit of smelling the stones. You will note, too, the faint indent of a boot, sole upon the parapet, half obliterated by moisture. A man stood here, leaned over, and cast something weighty into the river. That is our next object of pursuit." I glanced at the slow current, imagining papers, perhaps weighted with lead, dissolving into nothingness below. The notion that Sir Felix's missing documents had found their grave in those muddy depths sent a chill through me. Holmes paced a few yards along the embankment, crouched, and retrieved a scrap of sodden cord. It was frayed at the end, blackened, and exhaled a faint sweetness beneath the acrid reek of the river. "Rosewater again," he said softly, tucking it into his pocket. "This case is a bouquet that refuses to be forgotten." Lestrade's patience gave way. "What good is all this, Mr. Holmes?" A dead man, a rose in the ash, a locked door, and now scraps by the river. Unless you can tie it to a hand we can cuff, the super will have me on toast." "You mistake the sequence, Lestrade," Holmes replied calmly. "We do not first find the hand, and then the deed. We find the deed, and the hand will appear of its own necessity. Already the fibres are drawing together. We returned by cab to Baker Street, the city's fog settling like a veil upon our collars. Holmes was sunk deep in thought, his eyes half closed, the white rose from Renshaw's resting carefully across his knee, as if it were an honoured witness. I dared not interrupt him. At last, when we were once more before the fire of our rooms, he spoke. "Watson, you remarked upon the missing papers in Sir Felix's desk. You considered them financial trade disputes, perhaps. Yet a man does not risk fire and poison merely to efface quarrels of business. No, those papers were of another nature, private, dangerous to reputation. Sir Felix's circle is small, a niece dependent on him, a nephew indebted, a former partner estranged. Which of these had most to gain from a document's erasure?" "The partner. Phelps," I ventured. He had quarrelled and broken away. A damaging letter, perhaps. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A natural thought. Yet Phelps has not yet entered the scene in flesh, while our cousins and niece stand under the same roof as the crime. Never neglect the immediate circle, my dear Watson. Murder often walks nearest the hearth. At that moment, a knock came. Lestrade returned, hat in hand, his face flushed from the cold. "We've made inquiries at Bermondsey, Mr. Holmes. No messenger is owned to have brought the note that Miss Hargrave received this morning. None of the firms nor errand runners admit it, which means it came from a private hand, slipped in to look like common delivery." Holmes took the paper again, held it to the lamp, and ran his lens along the fibres. "Pencil," he murmured, "pressed by an unsteady hand. See the uneven downstrokes? And this is not a clerk's writing, a man unused to penmanship, or one who sought disguise. And look, here the tail of the Y cuts slightly through the wafer edge. The note was folded after writing, but sealed in haste." Lestrade scowled. Which of the household could that be? Holmes's answer was not direct. He crossed to the bureau, opened a drawer, and produced from within a sheaf of past correspondence, cases Watson had chronicled, scraps Holmes had preserved for reference. He spread them with a swift hand until he found a letter bearing the neat, slanted hand of Lionel Westcott, written 2 years past. He compared the flourish of the R with the scrawl upon the anonymous note. Not the same hand, he concluded, but perhaps the same fingers. The following morning found us again at Cheyne Walk, where Miss Hargrave awaited us with eyes hollow from vigil. She led us to the conservatory without word. There, among the glass and steam, the roses leaned pale and fragile. Holmes moved among them like a priest in his temple, touching nothing, noting all. "Your gardener, Dalrymple, is absent?" he asked. "Gone to the market at Covent Garden, sir," she said. Holmes bent over one plant where the soil was newly disturbed. With a small tool he turned the earth until the tip of something white appeared. He drew it forth, half a stem, singed at one end, its thorns carefully clipped. "The twin of our rose," he murmured. "Only this one has tasted flame." At that moment Lionel Westcott appeared, his manner jaunty, though his eyes betrayed unease. "Still prowling about the roses, Holmes?" "You will make a gardener of yourself." Yet Holmes turned, the pale stem between finger and thumb. "Gardening is a science, Mr. Westcott, much like detection. Each requires patience and the recognition that nothing grows without a root. You were in Bermondsey yesterday, I think?" Westcott started. "Bermondsey? Certainly not, and yet the note delivered to your cousin was penned by one who knows that quarters boys will carry messages without question. The phrase 'in vain' is not of a servant's vocabulary. It is the voice of one who has tried and failed. I tell you—" Westcott began hotly, but Holmes cut him short with a raised hand. "Do not trouble yourself." "You will have ample time to protest. Lestrade, keep an eye upon Mr. Westcott until we have looked further." The river has not yet spoken its last. We followed Holmes once more to the embankment, this time armed with grappling hooks and a constable's boat. For an hour we dragged the sluggish waters. It was Holmes who at last cried out, for the hook had caught upon something heavy. Together we drew up a sodden bundle, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine. Upon opening it we found not ledgers nor letters, but a small wooden casket, the sort that might contain jewellery or keepsakes. Its lock was broken and its interior empty, save for the faint, lingering fragrance of roses. Holmes held the box beneath his nose, closed his eyes, and nodded once. Here was our true quarry, gentlemen. The rose in the grate was no mere token, it was a sign, an emblem tied to this casket's contents. Someone wished to tell us that what was once within has been destroyed, as ash to ash. The white bloom was their signature. Whose signature, Mr. Holmes? Lestrade demanded. Holmes replaced the casket in its wrappings. That, my dear Inspector, is the riddle still. But we are closer than you think. The ashes lie not only in the grate, but in men's hearts. And somewhere among Sir Felix Hargrave's circle there is one whose hands bear both soot and petals. He turned then, eyes alight with that strange inward fire. Watson, we must see Mr. Phelps. For I think the quarrel of last year may prove more fragrant than we guessed. Mr. Phelps received us at his modest offices off Bermondsey High Street, a tall, angular fellow whose eyes carried both bitterness and fatigue. His manner was civil enough, though when Holmes named Sir Felix Hargrave, the muscles about his jaw twitched, as if from an old wound. He gestured us into a narrow chamber lined with ledgers, where the smell of ink and damp paper hung heavily. "You come about his death?" Phelps said, with the bluntness of one long resigned to suspicion. "I have heard already that tongues wag, that it was not accident. Well, you will find no tears here. I quarrelled with him, yes. He ruined me, cheated me of partnership, left me to scrape while he waxed fat. But I did not kill him." Holmes regarded him coolly, hands clasped behind his back. Sir Felix had papers in his desk. "They are missing. What sort of papers might he have possessed that touched your quarrel?" Phelps gave a short, harsh laugh. "Letters, perhaps. Agreements. He tricked me into signing away my share of the profits on a clause he buried in the fine print. I challenged him. He threatened exposure of a youthful indiscretion, a debt at cards which he had covered. He kept the evidence of it, no doubt, to wield when convenient. I would have given much to burn those papers. You placed no order at Renshaw's florists?" Holmes asked suddenly. "Renshaw's? Flowers?" The man blinked in honest bewilderment. "I can scarce pay my clerks, Mr. Holmes." "What business have I with hothouse roses?" Holmes inclined his head slightly, though his gaze did not waver. "What of a casket, small, wooden, lined with velvet, once in your possession?" Phelps paled, his hand tightening on the desk's edge. "So he kept it still, then?" "Yes, it was mine once, a gift, foolish in youth. It contained letters written by a lady now married to another. If they had surfaced, they would have ruined more than me. When I broke with Hargrave, I begged for their return." He laughed. "I offered."
"Money," he scoffed. "He said he would keep them safe until the day came that they might serve him. Safe, indeed." Holmes's voice softened, almost kindly. "You did not seek to recover them." "I sought it in every way short of crime." He would not yield. "And now, if they are destroyed, then it is God's mercy. But I swear to you, I never set foot in that house last night." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then turned abruptly to me. "Watson, note his hands. Ink stains upon the forefinger, but no trace of soil or soot. This man has handled nothing harsher than a ledger this past week." He bowed slightly to Phelps. "I thank you for your candour. The matter may not trouble you further, but should I need confirmation, I trust you will attend." We departed, leaving Phelps sagging in his chair like a man from whom a burden had been half lifted, half shackled, more tightly still. Holmes strode swiftly back towards the river, his gaze fixed inward. "The casket's significance is plain now," he said. "It held letters, dangerous letters. Their destruction was the true aim of last night's fire. The rose was not ornament, but symbol. Do you not see, Watson? Red roses were sent to mask the intrusion. White was left in ash as proclamation. Our enemy is a hand skilled in both concealment and display. They would have us read their work as theatre. I could not suppress a shiver. Then the crime was not merely to remove the letters, but to deliver a message. Just so, said Homie, in there lies the folly. Concealment succeeds by silence, not by flourish. Whoever set that flower wished to taunt, to claim authorship. It will be their undoing. We had not long returned to Baker Street when Lestrade appeared, his face alight with the air of a man who believes fortune favours him at last. He carried a small packet wrapped in brown paper. From the yard, Mr. Holmes. We had a rummage among the ash taken from the study grate after the fire was quenched. Found this in the siftings. He unwrapped the parcel to reveal a fragment of paper, scorched at the edges but still legible in part. The writing was delicate, feminine, and the words that remained visible were enough to set my pulse racing. Yours always, whatever vows may bind me. Holmes's eyes sharpened like a hawk's. A letter from the lady of Phelps's confession. Proof that the casket held what he claimed. Yet see here, the lower margin bears an impression where another hand has added figures. These are not of affection, but of finance. Curious, very curious, Lestrade frowned. So the motive was blackmail. That fits Phelps neatly. Not neatly enough, Holmes returned. Had Phelps sought to reclaim his letters, he would have stolen the casket entire, not staged so elaborate a conflagration. No, there is a subtler hand at work, one which wields sentiment as weapon, but aims at profit. We must return to Cheyne Walk, Watson. The
household is the crucible. The truth lies there still. Back at the Hargrave house, Miss Hargrave met us pale and composed. Lionel was absent, having gone out on some errand, she said. Holmes asked to see the servants assembled in the hall. One by one they came. Evans the valet, the cook, 2 maids, the boot-boy, and the butler, whose manner was stiffer than starched linen. Holmes's gaze passed over them as a physician might over patients. At last he spoke. Each of you has served Sir Felix faithfully, but one among you knows more of last night than has been said. The bell pull was tampered with. The grate was prepared with volatile oils. These are not the acts of strangers, but of one with access and time. I shall not accuse without certainty, but I advise that the guilty hand reflect before concealment becomes impossibility. A tense silence fell, broken only by the clock in the hall. No confession came. Holmes dismissed them, but I saw his eye linger upon the boot-boy's shrinking figure and the butler's rigid bearing. Later, in the study once more, Holmes moved swiftly from desk to hearth, from window to door, his mind knitting threads invisible to me. At last he paused before the watercolour above the mantel and gave a soft exclamation. He had drawn his lens close upon the smudge we had seen earlier. Watson, do you observe this faint trace? Not soot, pollen, white rose pollen, brushed here by a hand that steadied itself whilst placing the bloom. And what is most telling, see how high it lies, not the reach of a boy, but of a taller figure than not the boot boy, I said. Precisely. Our culprit wished us to suspect childish meddling, yet betrayed themselves by stature. That narrows the field considerably. He turned sharply. Come, Watson. There is one final thread to test. If I am right, we shall soon have the hand that set the rose in ash, and with that he swept from the room, leaving me with the uncanny sense that the noose was already drawn, invisible but tightening, around someone within these very walls. Holmes's stride carried us down the dim passage with such force that I was compelled almost to trot beside him. His gaze was inward, the lines of his mouth hard, as though the entire case had crystallized within his mind and required only the smallest nudge to bring the truth to light. We passed through the servants' stair and out into the mews, where the smell of damp hay and horseflesh mingled with the faint sweetness of the conservatory above. Holmes paused, lifted his head, and drew a slow breath through his nostrils like a hound upon the scent. "There is more rosewater in this house than the cook admits," he murmured, and his eye went to the narrow door beneath the conservatory stair. He tried the latch and found it unfastened. Within lay a store of odds and ends, gardening twine, broken crockery, a heap of sacking, and a brazier half filled with ash. Holmes bent at once, sifting the residue between long fingers. It was darker, more clotted than common coal, and gave off a faint perfume even in its coldness. He held it beneath my nose. "Charred petals," he said quietly, "the remnants of more than one bloom." Our culprit rehearsed the symbol before placing the final flower in Sir Felix's grate. A ritual act, Watson, meant to lend force to their gesture. He rose, brushing his hands, and stepped out again into the air, where Lestrade waited with his usual blend of impatience and grudging curiosity. "I have your message," said the inspector. "What devilry brings us to the back stair?" Holmes regarded him steadily. Devilry indeed, but of a human sort. The flower was not placed in mockery alone. It was a calling card. "Tell me, Lestrade, have you ever known a criminal resist the urge to inscribe his own signature upon his work?" "Plenty of them don't leave nothing at all," Lestrade returned. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "they always leave something. The art is in recognizing it. In this instance, it is a rose, white against ash. I have seen its twin forced beneath a bell glass in the conservatory. The stem was cut with a gardener's knife, but the placement, the flourish, was not a gardener's hand. No, this is the vanity of one who wishes their work admired." We returned to the main house, and Holmes asked instantly for Miss Hargrave. She came with calm composure, though there was fatigue in the set of her mouth. Holmes bowed slightly and indicated the study. "Miss Hargrave, you told me last night you never entered this room after 9. I am compelled to ask, did you not even look in when you heard no sound and knew your uncle was unwell?" She met his gaze steadily. "I did not. My uncle valued his solitude. I feared to anger him by intrusion. Yet you loved roses." The faintest flicker crossed her eyes. "I tend them, yes. My uncle permitted it." Holmes drew from his pocket the scorched stem he had unearthed beneath the conservatory stair. "This was not your uncle's permission. Someone rehearsed here before the act itself. It required a knowledge of your conservatory and access to your tools. Who else but you, Miss Hargrave, tends those plants?" She started to speak, then faltered. Colour rose faintly in her cheeks, but she pressed her lips together and gave no reply. Holmes turned aside, pacing the blackened hearth with long strides. At last he halted and wheeled round, his finger stabbing the air. "No, not you. You have neither the folly nor the pride. It is another who makes theatre of crime, one who quarrelled over debts, who lies with a smile, who taps impatient fingers at a florist's counter, one who returned this morning pale with the exertions of the night. Lestrade, where is Mr. Lionel Westcott?" The inspector stiffened. "Not in the house. He went out an hour past. Said he had business." Holmes's voice rang like steel. "Then you had best find him before London swallows him whole. For I tell you plainly it was his hand that placed the rose in ash." Lestrade hurried out with the vigour of a terrier, and Miss Hargrave sank into the nearest chair, her hands pressed together as though in silent prayer. I went to her side, for she looked sorely shaken, but Holmes remained erect and unyielding, his mind already leaping ahead. He quarrelled with Sir Felix. He needed money. He saw in those letters a chance both for profit and revenge. He purchased the Jacqueminos at Renshaw's to cloak his design, yet when the hour came, he could not resist the symbolism of the white Niphetos. It was vanity, Watson. Vanity is the chink in every armour. But the door locked, the key in Sir Felix's pocket, I began. A trifle. Westcott had but to feign the delivery of the box, step inside under the pretext of affection, and while Sir Felix was distracted, slip the volatile upon the grate. The door he locked himself when the old man was past resistance, knowing the servants would force it in the morning and believe it barred by the victim's own hand. The key he replaced in his pocket with a thief's dexterity. He relied upon fire to obliterate all trace, but fire is a treacherous ally. It spares what one most desires destroyed. At that instant the door burst open and Lestrade reappeared, breathless. "He's gone to ground, Mr. Holmes." Not a sign at his lodgings nor the clubs. His man says he left with a travelling bag. I've set men to the stations. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Then you must look not only to stations but to the river." "He has already cast one burden there. He may seek to cast himself." "Yet I think not. He will run, yes, but not forever. A man with pride enough to leave a rose will not vanish in silence. He will seek again to make his flourish, and when he does we shall be waiting." We remained at the house through the afternoon, Holmes restless as a caged falcon, pacing from room to room, his mind ceaselessly at work. Towards evening, as the lamps were lit along the river, a constable arrived with word that Westcott had been seen near Covent Garden, hurrying into a cab with a parcel beneath his arm. Holmes's face lit with grim satisfaction. "Just so," he said. "Covent Garden, where the flowers are sold at dawn and dusk." He cannot resist returning to his symbol. "Watson, fetch your coat. Tonight, the Theatre of Roses reaches its final act." We hurried by cab to the great market, where the lamps burned in rows and the air was heavy with the mingled scents of violets, lilies, and the last of winter's blooms. The bustle was less at that hour, but enough to conceal a fugitive. Holmes strode between the stalls, his keen gaze darting over every cluster of petals. At last he halted, one hand on my arm. "There," he whispered. Lionel Westcott stood at a stall piled high with roses, speaking in low tones to the vendor. He handled a bloom, turning it in his fingers, and I saw how his hand trembled despite the set of his jaw. Holmes stepped forward, and at that moment Westcott looked up, saw us, and bolted. What followed was a pursuit through the narrow passages of the market, past bales of straw and overturned crates. The fugitive darted like a hare, but Holmes, with surprising swiftness, was at his heels. Lestrade and I joined the chase, and at last Westcott stumbled against a cartwheel and was borne down by two constables. He struggled fiercely, but the strength of desperation cannot match the grip of justice. As they dragged him to his feet, I saw the bloom still crushed in his fist, a white niphetos, its petals bruised but unmistakable. He met Holmes's gaze with a bitter, defiant laugh. "You read my signature too well, sir. But tell me, what is a rose but ash in the end?" Holmes's reply was cold and precise. "A rose may wither, Mr. Westcott, but its scent lingers. And so will your crime." With that he turned away, the matter already set aside in his mind for the final ordering of evidence and explanation that was to come. Yet, as we rode back through the fog, I could not shake the image of the white rose standing in the black grate, nor the terrible pride of the man who had planted it there. For though justice had caught its quarry, the symbol remained, delicate and defiant, blooming still in memory's ash. At the yard they put Westcott into a bare room with a table and two chairs, and Lestrade, with unusual tact, allowed Holmes first questioning. The young man's bravado, so high in the market, ebbed like a tide before my friend's level eye. He owned to the Jacqueminos without fencing. He had ordered them, he said, to soften his uncle's humour before pressing for fresh advances. He owned, too, that he had gone later to Cheyne Walk, slipping in by the mews with a latch key he had never returned, and that he had entered the study when the house was still and the lamps burned low. "I meant to find money or paper that might be turned into it," he said, with a bitter laugh. "I found the casket and found it empty. I confess the rest. I played the fool. I poured a little benzoline on the dying fire. Yes, I knew where the bottle lay, and I thrust the white rose into the ash because it pleased me to sign my work. I thought the old man abroad and the house asleep. I did not see him there. His voice shook then, all pretence gone. When I looked to the chair and saw, God help me, I ran. I locked the door after me, that they might think what they did think." "You did not kill Sir Felix?" Holmes's tone was dry as parchment. "I did not." "You cut the bell cord?" "It hung by threads when last I drew it in that room a week ago." "I never touched it." Holmes regarded him a moment longer, and I knew by the slight relaxation at the corner of his mouth that a piece had fallen into place. "You are a vain and reckless young gentleman, Mr. Westcott," said he, "but I think you did not kill. You will, however, answer for your theatre. For the rest, leave that to me." Outside, in the corridor's stale air, Lestrade rubbed his chin. If he did not strike the blow or set the end that killed, then who? "The hand that wrote to him," Holmes returned. "For make no mistake, that note was meant for Westcott, though delivered to Miss Hargrave. You set the rose in vain. That is a taunt flung from safety. Our unknown had the letters before his folly. They watched him prink his scene and mocked him for arriving late." "Phelps?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head. Phelps had dread enough of those letters to pray for their burning, not to boast that the burning was needless. No, this is a cooler head and a nearer hand. Come, Lestrade, if you are willing to risk a small failure for a great success, I shall have your man to you before morning. Within the hour, we were again at Cheyne Walk. Holmes asked for the household, and received word that the servants were at their suppers, and Miss Hargrave retired with a headache. He sent Lestrade to whisper in the pantry that certain papers had been recovered from the river and would be laid upon Sir Felix's desk until the coroner could receive them in the morning. He bade that the whisper be carried no further than the servants' hall, and that the door of the study be left upon the latch, and the lamps trimmed low. "You will bait him with a half-truth?" I murmured, as we stood in the blackened room. "With a quarter-truth," said Holmes, and laid upon the desk, not papers, but 2 blank sheets, folded once, and sealed with a wafer. Guilt is credulous where hope is concerned. Now, one thing more, he took the poor watercolour from its hook and examined again the lower corner. "You will remember, Watson, the smear I called to mind on our first visit. Today I found within the smudge a light dust that was not soot but pollen. Why set one's hand here unless there is something to touch? The frame is clumsy work. Observe, his fingernails slipped beneath the moulding, the hole swung forward upon a hidden hinge, and behind it yawned a shallow cavity, no larger than a man's 2 hands set together. It was empty. By which I read," he went on, replacing the painting and dusting the lower edge with a faint veil of ash from the hearth, "that the letters lay here for a time, and were removed when danger came too near. Our man will come to make sure of them, or to move them again if he imagines we have found his nest. When he touches that corner, he will leave us his signature, as surely as ever Westcott did." He set upon the mantel the white niffertos he had carried like a witness all day. Now, sheltered beneath one of Dalrymple's bell-glasses. Vanity may bring him a step farther. We shall indulge it. We extinguished all but a single lamp, turned low, and withdrew behind the tall screen by the window where the heavy curtains muffled both our forms and our breathing. Time passed with that drawn-out quality peculiar to a watch. The house settled, a coal dropped once in the grate, the river made its slow, sullen sound beyond the panes. At last there was, very soft, the whisper of a shoe along the passage, and the lightest scratch at the latch. The door yielded a hair's breadth. A shadow entered. He stood a moment listening. He was tall. I could see against the dim oval of the bell-glass the outline of a head above the level I should have looked for in Evans, and too rigid for the gardener's loping stoop. He crossed to the desk with the confidence of one who knows the place in darkness, bent to the sealed sheets and restrained himself. It was masterly self-command. He did not touch them. He turned instead to the mantel. Very gently he lifted the bell-glass, and with a hand that did not tremble, removed the nephetos. He set it aside as one would a chalice, and reached for the lower corner of the watercolour. His thumb pressed. The frame yielded a finger's breadth. Holmes's hand touched my sleeve. All at once the room was daylight with Lestrade's lantern. The butler, grim, proper, impenetrable Dixon, started as if the light had struck him a blow. For 1 second he hung half-turning, his thumb still upon the moulding, and in that second Holmes stepped and had his wrist. It was not a rough seizure, it was absolute. The man's lips moved. No sound came. "You will smear the ash if you stir," said Holmes quite pleasantly, "and we should be sorry to lose so pretty a autograph." Lestrade? The inspector had his man. Dixon, feeling the cuff close, let out his breath, not as a rogue does, but as a soldier does when the parade ends. "You'll not make murder of this," he said quietly. "I never raised a hand to the master. I served him 20 years. I'd have served him 20 more if he'd left well alone." "You will tell that to a magistrate," returned Lestrade. "What we make of it depends upon what you have made already." Holmes released the wrist and held up his lantern to the man's face. There was no abjectness there. There was a contained fury, and beneath it, something like pain. "The letters," said Holmes. "Where are they?" "Safe," said Dixon. "For whom?" "For the lady that wrote them, and for the gentleman she married," he answered, very steady now. "I was in their house before I came to Sir Felix. I know what ruin means when a name is dragged. He found them by chance. He fined me with a look for not telling him whose hand it was, and he kept them like a chain. When Mr. Westcott began his pranks, I saw the end coming. I took them from that hole while the footman doused the flames, and I sent word this morning that he'd set his rose to no purpose. A poor taunt, maybe, but I was mad to think of it." "You sent the note from Bermondsey," said Holmes. "A lad I know. Carries for a chandler's there. It would turn the yard's head the wrong way. You used rosewater." "A drop, sir, on the papers." "Old paper. Stinks of smoke. I'd not have the lady sicken when she saw her own hand. If there's a sin in that, it's mine." "Where are they now?" Dixon's eyes, which had never begged, now implored without yielding. "If I speak, others suffer. If I do not, I hang, you'll say, for robbery of my master." "You will not hang for robbery," said Holmes, and there was a peculiar gentleness in his voice. "But you may hang, or another may, if the truth of last night is not put straight. Did you see Sir Felix alive after 10? Dixon swallowed. "No. Did you see him dead before dawn?" The pause was the faintest lag of a pendulum. "I saw him in his chair when the cry was raised." "He was as you found him. Holmes's eyes did not leave the man's." "Then tell me this and be exact. When you took the letters from the recess, was the white of a flower upon your sleeve?" "I never touched a flower in my life." said Dixon with a flash of scorn. "That was the pup's vanity, not mine." "Good," Holmes breathed, so low I barely heard. Aloud he said, "Lestrade, you will secure the butler, for theft if you must, for tampering with evidence if you prefer. You will not prefer murder. Not yet. Watson, we go to the conservatory. We went by the back stair, the lantern's beam throwing our shadows tall and wavering upon the whitewashed wall. The bell glasses stood in their row like small transparent tombs. Holmes moved to the cracked one, lifted it, and held it to the light so that the floor formed a perfect oval upon the flagstone. "Here," he said, tapping the rim. "The crack matches the smear I traced in the study, the same oval made upon the air. Our rose setter steadied the glass here, then steadied himself at the mantel. Dixon was right. It was not his hand. We have plucked the vanity from the stem. What remains is the thorn." He lowered the glass and looked towards the house where Lestrade's tread retreated with his prisoner. "One more move," he murmured, "and the thing is done." Holmes lingered over the cracked bell glass, his long fingers tracing the line of the floor as though it were a cipher. His expression was one I knew well, the stillness of a man whose mind moves with terrible speed. At last he set the glass down gently, like a relic, and straightened with decision. "Watson," he said, "we have caught the hand that concealed, but not the hand that struck. Dixon's theft was born of loyalty, not malice, the rose, the ash, the locked door. These remain unexplained unless we admit a darker figure." "You mean Westcott still?" I asked. "No, his folly served only as distraction. He set his theatre after the deed was done, finding Sir Felix already lifeless. That explains the locked door, the key in the pocket, and his terror when he found what his vanity had stumbled upon. No, Watson, our true adversary is subtler, one who needed both the fire and the flower. Consider who in this house had means to pour volatile upon the coals, to silence the bell-pull, and yet would not shrink from returning later to mock the nephew's efforts with a note. I thought of Evans, of Dalrymple, of Miss Hargrave herself. The notion chilled me. Holmes's gaze, sharp as a scalpel, did not leave my face. "Yes," he said quietly, "the mind moves at last to the inevitable." "It is painful, Watson, but necessary." "Miss Hargrave," I protested. "Surely not." She showed only grief, only composure, which is why the mask held. Recall her words. Her uncle detested flowers in the evening, forbade their scent in rooms save one. And yet who but she had roses beneath her hand, white roses forced under glass? Who but she bore the faint stain upon her finger, the mark I observed on our first visit, and which you dismissed as the trace of gardening? It was pollen, Watson, pollen transferred when she set the Nephitos upright in the grate. Dixon's thumb left its mark on the mantel, but hers left its dust, and above all, her motive. I scarcely breathed. "Her motive?" "Freedom," said Holmes, his voice low. "A woman bound hand and foot by a tyrannical guardian, living under his purse, subject to his temper. A woman who saw her cousin squandering what must one day have been hers, who feared perhaps that her own prospects would be blighted, who had reason enough to silence Sir Felix and to destroy the papers that might have further enslaved her. Phelps's letters were of no interest to her save as weapon. Dixon preserved them, she would have burnt them. But the fire she set failed in its completeness. Vanity tempted her to leave a token, just as vanity tempted Westcott later. The two vanities clashed, and between them the truth shines clear. Before I could reply, the sound of light footsteps came from the hall. The door to the conservatory opened, and there she stood, pale in her dressing gown, a shawl about her shoulders, her face luminous in the lantern's glow. She looked from Holmes to me, then at the bell glass upon the flagstone. "You know," she said simply. Holmes inclined his head. "I know." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. "It was never meant to be so cruel," she whispered. He sat there lecturing, railing at Lionel, at me, at the world. I thought only to daze him, to frighten him with the fumes, not to still his breath forever. When he slumped, I panicked. The fire seemed the simplest cloak, and the rose. She faltered, her hand trembling at her breast. The rose was my rebellion. He kept me from colour, from scent, from all that was mine by right. I wished him to see, even in death, that I had defied him. Holmes's face was unreadable. "And so you locked the door, replaced the key, and thought the house would believe in an accident." Tears glimmered in her eyes, but she did not deny it. "I never dreamt Lionel would play his foolish mask. I thought my act would vanish in cinders. When you came, Mr. Holmes, and spoke so coldly of evidence, I knew it was over." Lestrade had entered behind her, and now stood frozen, uncertain whether to move. Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet, Inspector." His tone softened. "Miss Hargrave, you sought only escape from tyranny, but the law will not weigh motives with so delicate a balance. Yet know this, your uncle's cruelty is recorded in every soul that lived under his roof. The court may find pity where he gave none." She drew herself up, dignity returning even through her anguish. "Then let it be so. I am weary of shadows. Dixon kept the letters to shield another. I will not ask his silence to shield me. Do with me what you must." There was a stillness then, broken only by the dull chime of the river clock through the mist. Lestrade stepped forward, heavy with duty, and laid his hand upon her arm. She did not resist. As they led her from the conservatory, Holmes remained by the cracked bell glass, his eyes on the white rose beneath it. At last he spoke, so low it was almost to himself. "A symbol may serve as a banner or as a noose. Vanity hung Westcott. Rebellion has undone her. Only the flower remains pure. We rode back through the fog-bound streets in silence. At Baker Street, Holmes cast himself into his chair, his face pale with fatigue, yet lit with that fire which only a solved problem could kindle. I could not hold back my question. "Holmes, do you feel no remorse in bringing her to this end?" He closed his eyes. "Remorse, Watson, is for those who judge. I do not judge, I reveal. The truth lies indifferent to pity or to wrath, and yet—" He opened them again, and a softer light was there. "I confess the white rose will haunt me. It was both her cry for freedom and her confession. In ash it bloomed, in bloom it withered. Such is the paradox of human folly." He reached for his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and the low, mournful note seemed to carry the image of that pale flower, standing proud amid ruin, into the night's silence. By noon of the following day, the fog had thinned to a mere dampness upon the air, and with it, as if in concert, the atmosphere of the case cleared in my friend's mind. Lestrade, heavy with the satisfaction of an arrest, had lodged Miss Hargrave at the station under a tentative charge. Westcott, for his melodrama in the market and his tampering with the scene, lay in a separate cell of a less serious complexion. Dixon, gloved still in his propriety, awaited the magistrate in a third. Holmes allowed the yard its arrangements, neither approving nor protesting, and directed his steps instead to Dr. Ainsworth, who had conducted the examination of the body. I accompanied him. The good doctor received us in his surgery, where the implements of his trade lay in an orderly quiet that contrasted with the violent business to which they had lately been put. He was a solid man, fair-minded, and he spoke without flourish. "No injury of a sort to kill outright," said he, consulting his notes. "A contusion at the left temple, insignificant, more a bruise than a wound. Lungs and air passages remarkably free of soot for one found in a smoke-tainted room. The blood is dark. In short, I would say asphyxiation by noxious vapour rather than burning, whether coal gas, benzoline fumes, or a combination. Well, I am no chemist." "Nor need you be," Holmes returned. "You have told me what I require, that death came with the vapour, not with the flame. Your notes, if you please, to be copied for the inquest back at Baker Street. He made but a single addition to his travelling case, a small phial from his own chemical shelf. And then, with that air of settled purpose I have seen upon him when events must be made to speak, he carried me once more to Cheyne Walk. The house endured us now as it had endured its master, without affection, but with obedience. Lestrade, to his credit, asked only, "What now?" and took up his stance with a patient look that I knew masked suspicion. "Now," said Holmes, "we end conjecture with sequence. We shall rehearse the night not as three actors playing three plays, but as one play whose scenes have been disordered by vanity and fear." He had the lamps drawn low in the study until the light was as it had been at 10. He opened the window a hand's breadth and shut it again, leaving upon his fingers the same smear of sodden soot he had observed before. He set Dalrymple's cracked bell glass upon the fender, and, at my shoulder, the white niphetos beneath it. The grate was cold, but its floor of ash had not yet been disturbed since the constables last sifted it. Holmes smoothed it with a hearth-brush until it lay level and fine as a table of flour. "You will observe, Watson," he said, and his voice had that dry clearness which became, in such moments, the very music of reason, that a stem thrust downward cannot stand upright in such a bed unless the ash is made to yield and then to hold. The naturalist uses a bell-glass to shelter, the actress uses it to set her mark. He lifted the glass, set it down lightly upon the ash, and lifted it again. A shallow ring remained, crisp and delicate. He then, with the least pressure of his forefinger, pushed the stem of the white rose into the soft ring and released it. The head stood improbably secure, as if the cinders had become a florist's frog. "Thus," said he, "the oval I traced upon the air at our first visit finds its counterpart, and the pollen we discovered upon the watercolour's corner its path, from the hand that steadied itself here to the hand that steadied itself there. Miss Hargrave placed her symbol. Vanity furnished the flourish, chemistry the means. Lestrade leaned over the grate, grudging admiration in his grunt. It does well enough, Mr. Holmes. But the door, the key? Westcott, Holmes answered, with a flicker of contempt. He arrived later, as his own mouth betrays, and finding what he had not the bravery to expect, he retired behind a locked door that he hoped would speak for him in the morning. It spoke more loudly than he dreamt. He turned to the bell-pull. As for this, the fray is old. Evans reported it. The gardener confirmed no new chord. A broken bell suited more than one. Last night it served all. He crossed then to the desk and with the same fastidious care as before, slid open the blistered drawer. He pointed with his pipe-stem to the soot shadow where papers had lain, and to the clear rectangle behind the poor watercolour. Dixon's honesty, an odd, stubborn variety, has its own testimony. He removed the letters only when fear of their discovery equalled fear of his master. He's not our death-maker. He wrote a foolish taunt because he could not help but sting the wasp who had menaced those he pitied. His rose-water, which I have here, he tapped the file in his pocket, belongs to a later hour and a different mercy. And the death maker? I asked. Holmes's gaze held mine. The lady who confessed. She confessed to more than she did, and to less. She meant a swoon. She found a stillness. That is the difference between intent and outcome upon which the law must sit. Yet even here the ordering has been muddled by two intrusions, the nephew's theatre and the butler's conscience. Strip those away and the story runs plain. He scolds. She, unstrung by a long tyranny, seeks to silence him with the fumes of a volatile she knows, in the ignorance of many, as a household servant, a stain vanisher, a Polish, a necessary evil. She pours it upon a low fire and closes the room that it may work quickly. He sleeps, the eternal sleep. Then, in a fever of half remorse and half defiance, she crowns the ruin with a white flower, that which he forbade her, makes fast the door, and flees. The rest is embroidery Lestrade had drawn nearer as he spoke, and I saw that the inspector's sense of justice, flat, reliable, unornamented, was wrestling with pity. "It will hang her," he said at last with no relish. "You have built the steps, and I must walk her up." Holmes's mouth took a line I had seen when he spoke to a dying woman in Cornwall and to a scoundrel in the Strand, the one line that fitted both. "You will walk the truth up, Lestrade. Not beyond it. If a jury cannot see the difference between a murder long plotted and a death born of a moment's madness, then our little island has forgotten nuance. I do not think it has." He turned then to me with a movement that was almost weariness. "There remains one point only to satisfy my conscience, the scent upon his lapel, which first pricked me. It was rosewater, not a rose. I thought at the time that it betokened an artificial flower among so many natural ones. In fact, it was the touch of Dixon's later mercy, brushed there when he handled the papers at the last. Even my own nose made a timeline and called it a single hour. Beware the senses, Watson. They are the cleverest liars we possess. He had the white niphetos returned to its glass, and the ash smoothed again, as if setting a stage for a curtain we should not see. The household, chastened and pale, kept to its rooms. Only Dalrymple, meeting us in the mews, lifted his cap with a grave, almost ecclesiastic air, as if the forcing of flowers had taken a consecration he had not meant it to bear. That evening at Baker Street, Holmes wrote 3 telegrams, to Renshaw for his clerk's sworn statement of the order and the tapping fingers, to Ainsworth for the certified notes, and to the coroner, offering himself to demonstrate in court how a bell-glass might make a bed of ash a pedestal. He then lit his pipe and watched the wreaths ascend until they drew a veil between us and the lamp. "You will write this, I suppose," he said at last. "If I do," I returned, "it shall not be to reproach her, nor to exculpate folly." He smiled without mirth. "As you please. Be sure only to keep the order, the true order. Men forgive much when they see how a thing came to be. Denied the sequence, they call it all by one hard name." He took up the violin. The first run of the bow upon the strings was harsh, then softened into a low, persistent tone, as if he would tune the day to a single note that refused to resolve. It seemed to me I could see in that sound the white head of the niphetos steady in the grey crater of ash, and beyond it the darker ribbon of the river, bearing away caskets and letters and the soot of 100 hearths, our city's own evidence, dissolved daily and forgotten, while the memory of one rose lingered like a small and obstinate truth. The inquest was held 2 days later in the vestry room at Chelsea, where a dozen tradesmen jurors sat with the grave and slightly dazed attention of men transported for an hour from their ledgers to mortality. The coroner, a brisk gentleman with a habit of smoothing the papers before him as if they were the surface of a pond, took the evidence in an order that suited the law, if not the truth. Dr. Ainsworth spoke first. The bruise at the temple was trifling. The lungs were free of soot. Death had come by poisonous vapour, not by flame. Evans swore to the key left on the table at 10:15, and to Sir Felix's custom of locking himself when engaged. The gardener spoke to the bell cords being frayed before the night in question, the cook to her bottle of rosewater, the boot-boy, crimson with fear, to the benzoline kept for polish. Renshaw's clerk, summoned by Lestrade's pains and a telegram from Baker Street, described the order placed for Jacqueminot's by a fair gentleman who tapped with his
left hand, Westcott, in a voice that tried for daring and fell into shame, admitted the rest, his entrance by the mews, the locked door, the white rose, thrust into ash to sign folly as if it were art. When Dixon was called, a stir went through the room, such as attends a name long synonymous with respectability. He stood very straight, his hands linked before him, and gave his account with the precision of a man accustomed to the inventory. He had known of the letters, he had hated their power, he had seen in the confusion of the morning his chance to remove them to safety. He had sent the cruel note in the madness of indignation, he had brushed the papers with rose-water to sweeten the reek of smoke. He had never touched a flower. Asked where the letters now lay, he answered that they were under the seal of a solicitor who would produce them at the court's command for return to their owner. The coroner frowned, but took the address. At last Miss Hargrave came, very pale, her veil lowered. She gave her statement without ornament or evasion. There had been quarrels, there had been tyranny. Her nerve had snapped as a cord snaps when it has been too long strained. She had poured the volatile upon the low fire to force silence, not to take life. She had set the white rose because it was the one thing forbidden her. She had locked the door because panic governs clumsily. Beyond that she gave no plea, and her voice did not waver when she named her act. It was then that Holmes rose from the bench where we had sat through the slow procession, and, with the coroner's leave, asked to demonstrate a point of mechanism. A constable brought in the cracked bell glass and the cold grate ash from Cheyne Walk. Holmes, with that neat economy which wins attention before a word is said, smoothed the cinders, set down the glass, lifted it, and pressed a stem into the softened ring until the white head stood firm and upright as if rooted. He showed, too, how a hand, steadying the glass, left an oval upon a higher surface, and from his pocket produced the card on which he had kept the crimson petal found in the Renshaw box, the one trace that told of Jacqueminot, never meant for the great at all. He spoke without rhetoric and with an exact sequence that, once seen, could not be untied. The frayed bell before the night, the volatile upon the embers, the rapid insensibility of an old man long coddled by overheated rooms, the emblem in white, the nephew's miserable mask to follow, the butler's removal of the letters and his tasteless taunt, the smell upon the lapel, explained not by a bloom, but by a later hand. The coroner smoothed his papers a little longer than usual before addressing the jurymen. He reminded them of the distinction between malice and rashness, of how the law names the one murder and the other manslaughter, and of their right, in an inquest, to find only the cause and not the degree. They withdrew, and were absent perhaps 20 minutes. When they returned, the foreman cleared his throat and, with relief very visible, delivered their finding. Death by misadventure through the inhalation of noxious vapours, the same having been applied by Miss Ada Hargrave under great provocation, and we append a strong recommendation to mercy. There was a rustle as of breath returning to a room. The coroner nodded once,
wrote 2 lines, and passed at once to the formal dispositions. I will not weary the reader with the dull procession that followed. The letters were produced to the magistrate and, upon proof by the solicitor of their authorship, restored under seal to the lady now long and happily married elsewhere. Westcott, after a blustering fortnight, took his sentence for tampering with evidence and for the disorder he had bred. He served it, and if report can be trusted, learned at last a thrift that no sermon had taught him. Dixon lost his place and kept his honour. A subscription among former employers sent him into a small tobacconist's near Battersea Bridge, where I have bought a pouch twice a year and found him as erect behind his counter as ever he had been behind Sir Felix's chair. As for Miss Hargrave, the Crown took the inquest's temper. Her committal was marked with a recommendation so emphatic that even a judge could not miss it. I am told she spent some months in seclusion at a house in the country, and that afterwards she married a quiet clergyman who had seen sorrow and therefore knew how to speak to it. If that last report is embroidery, I have no heart to pick it out. On the evening of the verdict, as the lamps came up along Baker Street and Mrs. Hudson's step sounded with its accustomed homely authority, Holmes lay stretched upon the settee with his hands beneath his head and his pipe unlit between his teeth. The white niphetos, which had become, by some tacit consent, the case's witness as much as any man, stood in a tumbler on the mantel, refusing to bow, even as its outer petals yellowed at the rims. "You have been very gentle," I said at last. He did not open his eyes. "Oh, I have been exact. Exactness looks like gentleness when it rescues the order of events from the tangle of emotions. It is not gentleness. It is the only kindness I know, and yet," I ventured, "you cannot dislike the jury's word." "I dislike words that pretend to be verdicts," he returned, and now he turned the pipe between his fingers. "But if we must have one, misadventure is better than the honest lie men call justice. The law hangs labels, I set things in their places. Between the two, sometimes a woman is not destroyed." He rose then, went to the mantel, and regarded the flower with an air at once sardonic and oddly fond. "There was a moment, Watson, when the case tried to be cleverer than itself. It offered us 2 signatures, the lady's in pollen and the young gentleman's in petal, and hoped the more brazen would draw our eye. That is vanity's
old trick. Remember it. When 2 hands sign, believe first the lighter pressure." He put the pipe aside, took up the violin, and drew from it those grave phrases that have for me become a sort of index to his spirit. The sound filled the room, thinning the day's talk to a thread, and then cutting it altogether. I sat and watched the smoke of the fire lie low in the grate, as if even it had learned to bloom without flame. And I thought of the river bearing away another casket, another ash, while London forgot as it always does. Only on our mantel a white rose persisted, and in my notebook a title waited for its case. In the quiet that followed the inquest, I found myself, as I often do at a case's end, beset by those small dislocations that remain when the large pieces have been put to rights. I said so to Holmes. He had the niphetos laid flat upon blotting paper and was with a scalpel separating a few stubborn grains of ash from the bruised cuticle of the stem, as tender as any surgeon at St. Bartholomew's. "It will not do," I observed, "that Westcott claimed the white rose, and yet you show me Miss Hargrave's pollen upon the frame." Holmes did not look up. "Men frequently confess to the wrong sins, Watson. It is less painful to avow a theatrical trespass than to own one's paltry cowardice. He wished to be the rogue of his own story. The evidence denies him the part. His signature is crimson, not white, the Jacquemino petal I found trapped in the box lid. He handled the reds. He bragged himself into the white. Vanity again, only of a cheaper dye. And Dixon's note, I said, still fretting the threads. You were certain before he spoke. Certain by its aim and its hour, Holmes replied, laying the stem aside and washing his fingers in a saucer he kept for such niceties. It mocks Westcott, not the lady. It arrives when the household is yet reeling and is delivered as if from Bermondsey in order to tip your Lestrade off the scent. A servant might send such a bait with safety, a nephew could not. Then there is the rosewater, dense, clinging. A woman who lives under prohibition does not perfume papers, she burns them. Dixon is of the sort that would sweeten smoke for a lady's sake and call it duty. I laughed softly. You have made a moralist of a butler. I have not made him anything, said Holmes. I have observed him. The law is content to label. I prefer the man as he is. He put away his scalpel, and with that abrupt dismissal of tools, which means his mind has closed the drawer upon a subject, turned to the fire. It had burned low. He stirred the cinders once, watched the small collapse and the brief breath of heat that followed, then let the poker fall to the grate. You will say, if you must print it, that there were 3 hands and 3 hours, he went on. First, the lady, with her volatile and her grievance. Then the butler, with his scruple and his foolish message.
Last, the nephew, with his borrowed key and his borrowed courage. Each believed himself the centre. None of them was. The centre was a white flower and a lifetime's habit of tyranny. The one flared, the other suffocated, and you, I said, are content that misadventure should stand where murder might have been forced. He gave me a look in which there was severity for a moment, and then the faintest shade of weariness. Content is not my trade. Sequence is. Give a jury the order, and they will often find the mercy themselves. If they do not, I cannot invent it for them without ceasing to be of use. I am neither judge nor priest. I am, at best, a corrector of ledgers. You might have been a barrister, I ventured. I might have been a gardener, he returned, with a glance at the flattened rose. Both professions concern themselves with cutting away growth that has gone astray. But the gardener has the better music. There was a little silence. The street door closed below with Mrs. Hudson's careful hand. A coster's cry went by thinly. Somewhere in the house, a clock considered and decided not to strike. I took from the mantel the card upon which lay the single dried petal from Renshaw's box. It had darkened to a winey brown. Holmes, I asked, what would you have had her do? Ask me what I would have had Sir Felix not do, he said, and the harshness in it startled me. There are men who manufacture tragedies by the ton and call it order. She took to herself a power she did not understand and paid for the presumption. He trafficked for 20 years in powers he understood all too well and paid for nothing. You perceive my difficulty in striking a balance. You have been very gentle with her nevertheless. Exact, Watson, he corrected, but the edge was gone. Exactness spared her the gallows more surely than sentiment would have done. Sentiment is the enemy of sequence. It scrambles the hours to excuse or to condemn. Keep the hours straight, and men, even when they punish, sometimes remember they are human. He set the Niphetose petal beside the crimson one, and, with the pad of his finger, aligned them as if they were entries in a column. There is your title if you must have one, he said. The white and the red, ash and bloom, 2 signatures, and the arrogance that thought to hide one beneath the other. He smiled without mirth. I will leave you to embroider the moral. You require no embroidery, I returned. Only the last stitch, the philosophical one that you dislike and that readers insist upon. Very well, he said. rising and reaching for the violin. "Here is your stitch. A symbol is a dangerous ally. It tempts the timid to strut and the desperate to proclaim. When a crime puts on a flower, look for a hand that prizes effect above safety. And when you find a flower blooming where no flower should, suspect not providence, but preparation." He tuned a string, then another, and as the instrument found its proper voice, the jumble of the last days settled into coherence as figures upon a slate returned to their places under a schoolmaster's hand. In that dim, tobacco-scented room, the river's breath seemed far away. Cheyne Walk might have been an engraving. Miss Hargrave's pale face, Westcott's arrogant pallor, Dixon's rigid mouth, these were prints laid flat for keeping. Only the scent of the rose persisted in imagination, faint as a memory, half rebellion, half confession. A knock sounded. It was not Lestrade's. It had too much uncertainty for an inspector. Mrs. Hudson's step preceded a young woman's, modestly dressed, a parcel in her gloved hands. She asked for Mr. Holmes with a courtesy that belonged to an earlier generation. He set the violin aside. "If you please, sir," she said, "Mr. Dixon bade me leave this. He said you would know where it should go." She placed upon the table a small casket, plain wood, newly planned, the velvet within fresh and unused. A slip lay upon it in Dixon's spare, soldierly hand. "For keeping what should not again be kept." Holmes regarded it a moment, and then, without opening, passed it to me. "Take it down to the river, Watson," he said quietly, "and throw it in empty. We will not tempt London with receptacles." When I returned from that sober errand, the room was as I had left it, save that the white niphetos, now truly spent, had been removed from the blotter to the mantel again and stood there in a small glass beside my friend's pipe. Holmes drew the bow once, lightly, and smiled the thin smile with which he greets his own concessions to sentiment. "You see," he said, "even I permit a flower to bloom in ash when it has learned the use of silence." There was no more to be said. The day lowered into evening, the lamps came up, the city resumed its great indifferent murmur. Presently the bell would sound, and another client with another pattern would cross our threshold, and Holmes would set aside rose and river alike to hear the footfall of a fresh sequence begin. Until then we sat as we have sat 100 times, the detective with his instrument and his iron mind, the doctor with his pen and his patience, while upon the mantel the last pale petals loosened by degrees and fell, one by one, into the grate where, for an instant before the draught took them, they seemed to blossom once more in ash,